Jeff, you know what the problem is, bro? Do you know what the problem freaking is, bro? Kevin freaking Owens, bro. This guy, you're gonna make this guy a wrestler, bro? Are you freaking for real, bro? Do you remember back in the days, bro? Steve Austin, bro, he came down there in a freaking beer truck. Now we're gonna put the title belt on Kevin Owens, bro? Ridiculous. And you know what's the problem, Jeff? You know what's the problem, Jeff? You talk about an internet darling like Kevin Owens, bro. What happens, bro? The marks, bro. The Jeff, the marks come after you, bro. Bro, I don't want to talk about wrestling anymore, bro. I'm done. I'm done, bro. I am freaking done. Now, what I'm gonna do is play a message from Vince McMahon back in the day, bro. Oh yeah, this is Vince. Shut up.